What are y'all talking about today?
Whatever Brett wants to talk about. Welcome to the Front Porch, Empower Mississippi's official podcast. I'm Russ Latino, sitting next to the incomparable Brett Kittredge, my buddy and my pal, our communications guru. Brett, what's up today, my man?
Oh, just having a good day, Russ. How have you been recently, man?
Man, it's been blowing and going. A lot going on right now. I know we've got a lot to talk about today. Give me a sense of what's on tap.
Yeah, let's talk about income tax hearings and talk a little bit more. We've been talking about the income tax, and Power's been talking about it for months, obviously, now. Let's have some more discussion about that, specifically, how are we going to recoup the money that comes from the income tax. A story we got online Monday about a man named Michael Moore who was in prison for 19 years. He is now out because of the Parole Eligibility Act. He was previously not eligible for parole. We talked with him, we've talked with his family, a little bit about what he's doing, talk a little bit about re-entry. Let's talk about, let's talk about culture, and more than that, sort of a loss of faith in institutions. That's obviously a broad
That's a broad topic, so we'll talk about that for the next 45 minutes. No,
correct.
This is something that's been top of mind for me for a while.
Sure.
And I think a big part of it is just watching sort of dialogue between the two sides, if you will, and how dialogue is broken down and how each side views the other side, not only as someone who is wrong about something, but as someone who comes with bad motives, someone that's evil. And I think a big part of this, really heading into COVID, was that we saw sort of faith and traditional institutions breaking down. And so if you think about it, there's always been reason not to trust government entirely. But I think most people viewed the U.S. government, or viewed government generally, as a core institution in our society. And we've gotten to the point now where there are huge swaths of people that not only have skepticism, which is healthy, but candidly look at anything that comes from the government as being fundamentally untrue, or some form of corruption, or some effort to manipulate and exploit. Same thing in our communities. You think about the role media plays. There's almost no trust for media. Now, they've brought a lot of that on themselves. I just feel like there's increasingly this sense of consumerism in the way that people operate, where people are looking at a church and they're saying, hey, we want to go to that church for what it gives me, or how it reaffirms what I already believe, versus saying, there are objective truths that can be taught, things that I can know that are true, whether I'm a Republican or a Democrat, white or black, no matter what demographic you put me in, there are things that are true. The problem is if you start to believe that there are all these alternative truths out there, or that truth is unknowable, is that you have society legitimately break down, because there's no way to win an argument at that point. If you're having a conversation about the efficacy of medicine, and the end result of that conversation is, well, that's true for you, but not for me, well, then it stops any real opportunity to have a common understanding, which I think is sort of the fabric of society, is the ability to build those common understandings. And so I'm concerned about that. I don't know how you fix it. I think there's just so much information out there that people feel like they don't know what to believe and what not to believe. And so they gravitate towards what naturally makes them feel good, or what naturally kind of confirms their own bias, and that's risky.
Well, is this new? I mean, the ability for someone to share their opinions on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook, whatever, right, where you see a lot of videos, you see a lot of, you can gin up a lot of energy and a lot of supporters. Is this something new? Is the fact that we have this ability to reach a mass across the country sort of feed this?
I think it's new in the sense, first of all, I would say that social media by and large is a positive development, right?
I agree.
It allows for people to have their voice heard that would previously not have had their voice heard.
Right.
The downside of that is you have a risky scenario where you're giving a microphone, in some cases, to people who aren't doing good research, or who are unscrupulous, or they have their own agenda, and those people can easily mislead. And so I want there to be more speech, not less, right? I think it's foundational to a functioning society, but I think it's something we've got to grapple with, because there is so much disinformation out there. There is such a tendency to accept those things that, again, sort of naturally appeal to our own bias versus seeking truth, that I think it's risky long term.
Facebook plays a large role in this, all the social media companies, in terms of they have tried to go out and say, no, this is false, no, this is true. And as someone who's more on the side of skeptical, whenever I see a Facebook warning, I'm like, okay, I believe the exact opposite just because Facebook said it.
Sure.
And we've seen things change. I remember last summer, there were CDC prospective guidelines for the next school year that said kids are going to have to wear masks, kids are going to have to be distanced in the cafeteria or not go to a cafeteria, which was 100% how school went down. And it was what CDC put out. And Facebook said, no, this is false. They flagged that, people started sharing an infographic, and to where I'm just like, what is going on here? And there's lots of other discussions in terms of who is the owner of the content, who is the owner of the platform you're using.
Yeah, I would just say that I think it's broader than COVID, right? I think COVID is front of mind,
yes,
for a lot of people. But if you think about, crises tend to accelerate trends. And so what I would say is you already had this sort of erosion in core institutions of government, of media, of community, of business. You see a lot of anti-business sentiment rising up too, really in both the sort of left and right political ideologies.
I think what that business says.
I think what COVID did was to accelerate that trend. And I'm with you, obviously part of the scientific process is discovering new things, and ideas change. I think the difficulty is when there's mass communication and literally millions of outlets sort of interpreting that data. It's very easy to rely on past information. It's very easy to rely on information that is less than credible. And it's hard to figure out what is actually true. I think, I've always been a big believer that the way that you sort of win in the marketplace of ideas is to have better ideas and to be willing to vocalize them. And so, I think the other danger is there are a lot of rational people who have taken a step back because the debate is so frenzied and so ugly and so rancorous that at times the truth isn't being said because people just don't want to argue. And so you're left with sort of a lowest common denominator arguing a lot of times versus having people who have actual knowledge or actual experience step into the fold and provide leadership. And this is a bigger question, but I think it's a question of the difference between sort of a populism that says, whatever the prevailing will of my base is, that's what I'm going to go out and say is right, versus leadership that's willing to say, sometimes my base may not agree with me, but I'm going to develop the knowledge and the ability to provide leadership that ultimately is in the best interest of people. And candidly, that's what we need. I saw Joe Lonsdale tweeted this. Joe's a tech innovator. He said we need fewer influencers and more leaders in the United States, and I think that's true.
Donald Trump held a rally in Alabama over the weekend, promoted the vaccine, got a not great round of applause. It was kind of a funny discussion, and I've heard lots of people say, or not lots of people, a few people say, why didn't you bring out Trump to promote the vaccine to help some of the people? So it's just interesting in that regard.
Well, and again, it's because trust has been eroded, right? And so even someone who, to that audience, is viewed as a trusted figure, to them, or at least a portion of the audience, he went too far. Now, of course, it's always struck me as a little silly, considering the fact that Operation Warp Speed, that brought the vaccine to market, was actually his administration's doing.
Mm-hmm. It is, and we can talk about this forever, but how much is this when Republicans in office, Democrats don't trust, when Democrats in office, Republicans don't trust? Is this more than just that normal?
I think there's an element of that, but I think it's actually deeper than that too. I think that there is a segment of the population, and I don't think it's solely on the right or the left. I think it's both sort of political ideologies have this, that just fundamentally no longer trusts the core institutions of society.
What does that lead to?
Well, I mean, I think the risk is that it leads to a breakdown in society, right? It leads to a divided America, and not divided in terms of disagreements on public policy, but genuinely some antipathy towards other people. There was a poll done a year or two ago, and it was interesting. It basically said that Republicans and Democrats view themselves the same way as the Israelis and the Palestinians view each other. Now, with the same sort of sentiment and the same intensity of disagreement. Well, I mean, the Israelis and the Palestinians have been killing each other for decades. I mean, they've been launching missiles into each other's territory. And so it says something scary for the future of our country if we view people who have different ideas with that much animus.
How's Russell Latino going to fix this?
I don't know how to fix it myself. What I would say is that organizations like Empower have to be out there promoting positive solutions that help everybody. And we've got at times to be willing to break with sort of a populist direction and say, based on the data or based on information, we think these are the kinds of solutions that ultimately benefit the most people. But I would also say, look, I've been in the public policy world for a long time now. Me banging my head against the wall or even Empower doing the work by itself is insufficient. More Americans have got to sort of take a leadership role in their families and in their communities and trying to break down some of the walls that have been put up. Otherwise, it's going to be hard for us to survive as a country.
So, one of those solutions Empower has been working on, talked about in the lead-in, is the income tax repeal. Have the hearings coming up. Let's talk about that. So with the income tax proposals, heard a few ideas, heard some criticism, particularly those who view it as government is going to lose funds that they use to fund certain programs. Obviously, education is the largest item in our general fund budget. It's half our budget, half our state budget. So naturally that would be the loudest voice. How do you respond to that? Well, how do you see it? What does the data show us?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're right. First of all, we've been talking about it for a while. I think we've got these hearings coming up on Wednesday and Thursday of this week. The legislature's bringing in a bunch of tax experts.
And who else?
And I'm going to offer some testimony as well. I've been studying this issue almost for a decade now as a possibility for Mississippi. And really,
As has Speaker Gunn, to be fair, too. I know
yeah, no doubt. And so I think for me, the interest has always been, can we create an environment where more people want to stay here and work, where we're encouraging productivity, creating more jobs, higher wages. And there's some evidence that states, a decent amount of evidence that states without income taxes are able to do that at a clip that we're not able to do right now. And some of that's intuitive, that if you're not taxing income, you're not taxing productivity, you're encouraging productivity. So all of that is out there. I think the sort of the natural criticism that comes back, or skepticism that comes back, is, well, if you eliminate the income tax, how are you going to fund government? We've talked about this in the past. The 9 states that don't have income taxes have no problem funding government. They have a lower overall tax burden on their population, but they've seen revenue increase to state treasury at a much greater pace, and that's because their actual economy is growing. And so part of this is the risk of getting the budget slashed dramatically really isn't there, in part because we've got the experience of these other 9 states, but in part because we also know that the way that the current bill at least is designed is it's designed not to allow those sorts of cuts. And so there's an offset component, and then the rest of the elimination of the $2 billion in income taxes occurs over a period of time as revenue grows in the Treasury. So there's no risk in the current formulation that what you end up with are sort of draconian budget cuts as a result of this. What they have said is that we're going to limit the growth of government spending by 1.5%. So it's not that we're flatlining government spending or even cutting government spending. We're reducing the rate of increases in government spending,
which is a cut in terms of
it's not a cut, but
that's how it's
not a cut at all. It's a reduction in an increase. It'd be like saying, well, I thought my boss was going to give me a raise to $50,000. He gave me a raise from 40 to 45, so he he cut my salary by $5,000. No,
But that's
he gave you a
literally-
$5,000 raise.
But that's literally what they say in D.C.
Sure,
right,
well-
when it comes to budgets.
Well, and it's goofy, right? So
Right.
so let's set aside the goofiness of calling an increase a cut, because only in government would that make any sense.
Right.
I think what we've seen is this argument from certain quarters. Nancy Loom had an op-ed from the Parents Campaign on Sunday that essentially said, hey, education spending is going to be cut if this bill goes into effect. Even she had to admit that what we were talking about is a reduction in the increase in spending in her op-ed. A few things of note, like one, again, there's no evidence that that's the end result based on the 9 states that don't have income taxes. Two, as I said, it's designed in a way not to have real cuts. The third thing I would say that people need to be aware of is the state of Mississippi has experienced about a 10% reduction in the number of students enrolled in public school over the last decade. So it went from about 490,000 to about 440,000, about a 50,000 student reduction. At the same time, the state of Mississippi is investing $300 million more than what it was investing 10 years ago in K-12 education. So what we're literally talking about on a per pupil basis in terms of state support is about a 30% increase in a decade for every student that's in a Mississippi public school. So this notion that the legislature has somehow dramatically underfunded education, or it's been cutting the amount that's getting spent on students, just simply mathematically is untrue. And if you look at what the legislature has been willing to do over the last couple of years, there have been separate spending on teacher pay raises. There's still a push for more teacher pay raises. All of that has been done to try and make the system more competitive. And so I think it's a little disingenuous to suggest that a slowing of the growth is the same thing as a cut that's going to have a negative impact on students when you've seen literally a 30% increase in per pupil spending over the last decade.
It seems as if there are certain people who'd be fine if we just continue with this status quo. So we keep our tax structure the same. You sort of know what you're getting and are not willing to go out and try. I mean, it's more than just trying something new. When you talk about income tax repeal, it's, talk about doing something bold to truly, revitalize, revamp Mississippi. It's sort of like there's a certain camp that'll be fine. Like, okay, we just keep going, getting this little growth, whatever Mississippi's growth has been over the past decade has, been very, very little compared to, these ideas of, okay, we can be like these states. And it's just sort of,
Well, I mean, I think at some point what we've got to realize, Brett, is that the status quo is unacceptable, right? And if you've experienced no economic growth when adjusted for inflation, that's true in Mississippi over the last decade, and slow growth even before then, no wage growth, when you're not seeing new jobs being created, when you're seeing us lose population, when you know that we're at the bottom of the heap in so many different categories, whether it be health or education, then the status quo is really irresponsible. Right? It's locking you into something that is not beneficial to the people of Mississippi long term. And so, I do think we've got to go bold, and I don't think this is the kind of bold that looks like throwing spaghetti against the wall, though, because I do think you've got 9 other states that show an example of how it can be done, and plenty of economic evidence that people move towards no income tax states, that capital moves towards no income tax states. And in a situation where we're losing the productive portion of our population, that these kind of policies help to hang on to those people age 25 to 55 that are kind of the drivers of the economy.
and that's the status quo. I mean, the truth is, we can cut that. That's the status quo, right? The truth is, we've been losing population over the past decade. As you mentioned, we're losing students. We're losing that age population. And so it is just, it's not something we can continue to do and expect something better to happen.
Well, and I think part of the argument sometimes is, well, you could do something like try and make us less dependent on government and grow the economy, or you can try and invest more resources into government. And there's a fundamental philosophical divide about what prospers people or benefits people the most. I get that, but I would argue that for a long time, Mississippi has actually made substantial investment in government itself. We've got the 4th or 5th largest public sector employment in the country. as a percentage of our population, which is a big deal. We certainly have seen increases in spending over 3% a year over the last decade at the government level. At the same time, Mississippi's economy has been stagnant.
Correct, and our population hasn't been growing.
Correct. So I mean, there have been considerable investments in government. I think the way to turn around Mississippi, it's not, government has a role, but it's not going to be government driven. It's got to be people driven. It's got to be the private sector stepping up. And so the question is, how do we create, as a matter of public policy, the incentives for the private sector to grow, for people to move to Mississippi, to see our communities thrive in a way that ultimately will benefit the role of government itself. And I think the elimination of the income tax, if done correctly, is part of that recipe.
Look forward to hearing what you have to say this week, Russell. Moving beyond that, this week, Joanna Holbert, our very talented director of outreach, did a story on a man who recently left prison.
She's the best of all humans. It's really what you wanted to say, right?
I mean, we can go there, Russell.
I mean, she's behind the camera, so.
Correct. So, and she's like very calm about it too. She's
the best of all humans. But tell me about her story.
Yeah, so a man named Michael Moore, not the filmmaker, was in prison for 19 years. Previously had been sentenced, was not eligible for parole until the Parole Eligibility Act went into effect in July. He was, from what we've been told, the first person released under the new candidates for parole. We had talked with his family prior to his leaving prison, and then he's been out since early August, visited with him, and just sort of to catch up and talk about some of the neat things. He has a job in construction with a family friend. He has a strong family, a mom, has sisters who are sort of there for him, and it's a neat story at our website. Definitely check it out. But just talked about some of the things, like first time they went out to eat, he had a menu, and it's like, what am I supposed to do? You know, for 19 years, I've been told to wear this, to eat this, to go here at this time, and now I'm thrown out into the free world trying to, make a living.
Yeah, no, I mean, Michael's story is pretty incredible. He made a dumb mistake as a teenager, right? I think he was 17 or 18 years old, and went with another individual into a convenience store. The other guy had an unloaded BB gun.
Yeah.
And the end result was an armed robbery charge that got him 20 years. And sort of the backstory is there was originally like a plea deal that the prosecutor eventually yanked, and so he was essentially not gonna go to prison, and then ended up getting a 20-year sentence for armed robbery, which is a serious offense. Did 19 of those years, got out with the Parole Eligibility Act. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where the beauty of that act is it allows somebody that goes in at 18-year-old as a, stupid offender, for lack of a better way to put it.
Sure.
Something that shouldn't have happened, to prove as they grow up that they're different, that they're changed, right? And so, Michael only got out a year early. He had a year left on his sentence. But the support network that he's got is pretty impressive. I think that's one of the things that the parole board really focuses on when they're considering folks for parole. It's not just what were you put in for, how much time have you served, have you been good or not, do you have marketable skills or not, but like what's the support network look like for you? Is there family? Are you going back to a bad situation? Do you have a job lined up? And to his credit, he had that support network. A lot of people don't have the advantage of that, unfortunately. I think there's going to be a large conversation this year. Last year really focused on, can we right-size the parole system or make changes so there's at least an incentive for people who are in prison to behave well, to invest in themselves.
Which is what he talked about, was that he's like, there was no incentive up until this year or last year with the bill that was vetoed. I mean, there was no incentive. It's like, I'm out in 20 years regardless, right? So, yeah.
No, I think that's right. I think this year, though, the shift will be from, can we create that incentive, to what are the systems that can be put into place so that when someone gets out of prison, it's less likely that they get put back into prison.
Right.
And there are all sorts of ideas floating around right now about what reentry reform, which is what it's called, looks like. Empower plans to be a big part of that conversation over the next year, because we know that 95% of people sitting in prison will one day be released. We know that there is a high recidivism rate, which means people get out, do something bad, and go back in. And so what is it that can be done to reduce that recidivism rate, which not only is good for our communities and good for those individuals, but it's good for the pocketbook of the state when it comes to correction costs. And so, yeah, a lot of it is about, is there the right kind of housing in place? Is there training for workforce? Do you have that support network that allows you to be successful? Some of it's simple stuff like, are there licensing restrictions that prevent you from working?
Correct.
Or can you get a driver's license that allows you to get to work? And those are things that Empower has worked on in the past and that we'll continue to work on to make sure that there aren't institutional hurdles when people are getting out of prison.
Yeah, it was just neat, so he went in as a 18 or 19-year-old, comes out as a 38-year-old 20 years later, and how much the world has changed, right? Like one of the things, Joanna's been texting him. It's like he had never sent a text message in his life. And, that's not a big thing at the end of the day, but that's just, I just can't imagine being someone who's sort of so locked down in society, and all of a sudden, you're just in this brave new world.
Yeah, I mean, look, we take all sorts of things for granted, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned it, like going to a restaurant and seeing 40 options when you're used to one.
We think that's a good thing. And
right.
For him, it was just like too much, right?
Yeah, and so that's another big part of reentry, though, is getting people acclimated to making decisions again. Because for people who've been in prison for a long time, they've been kind of deprived of the ability to make those choices. And so it's pretty important early on to get people acclimated to, I do have choices now. I can decide where I work. I can decide what I eat. I can decide where I shop. Those sorts of things, what kind of clothes I wear are things that people lose track of, I think, when they're institutionalized.
Yeah. So one of the other, one of the things with Michael we talked about, obviously he had a great support staff. Another lady who we've talked with, we'll have a video coming out soon. We have a couple promos for it up on various social channels right now. A lady named Julie Crutcher, office and purchasing manager at Musey Bath. We've talked a lot about Musey in the past, or with Musey, about some of the work they do in employing those leaving prison. But the first time she talked about coming out of prison, her system was people she knew before prison, right? So she was like, hours later, I was doing drugs again. And so it's just sort of that contrast. Obviously, she then found rehabilitation and then work, right? So work's that other key component that is still out there, that still remains to be seen.
No, I mean, look, the number one indicator if somebody's going to recidivate or not is, can they find a job? If they find a job, there's a very good chance that they're not going back to prison. And so it is incredibly important. Like we talk about licensing, and a lot of people don't get that. But if you're literally, preventing somebody from looking at a quarter of the jobs in the state, then that's a difficulty that could be insurmountable and yield somebody being back in prison.
Correct.
But Julie's story is incredible, and I can't wait for the general public to see the video that you guys have put together, because I think it's pretty compelling.
Yeah, she's a cool person. It's just one of those where sort of we talked a little bit about faith in institutions. Can at least have faith in people. Sure. And someone like Julie, who struggled growing up, as many people who end up in prison do. She went through a lot, and here she is, has her family, has her career. And it's just sort of, what you love to see. And especially, I know you believe in people, I believe in people, believe people are good. And she's just an example of someone who society could have or would have written off.
Yeah, I think what you just said is really powerful, right? If the faith in institutions are eroding, which it is, sometimes just sitting down with a person.
Yeah.
And realizing this person isn't bad, this person's not trying to pull one over on me, versus thinking about that person as a representative of an institution can change the way that we think about things. I think that's an excellent point. So Brett, we've talked about a lot of serious stuff today. Some good content. Some things hopefully that we can keep talking about in the future. But life is more than pondering deep things. Sometimes you got to kick back and have a little fun. I can tell by your shirt that you're into the country music. It's becoming a staple of these programs. I think you put it on just for these programs, but it's cool. I understand that you like the modern country a little bit more than maybe I like the modern country.
Well, I appreciate you calling it modern country, Russell. I do. I am a fan.
When they rap in the middle of the country?
Some people do. Some people don't. But
you got the concert.
I'm a fan of having a good time. And so, yes, we are going to the Luke Bryan show at the Brandon Amphitheater this weekend. Saw him a couple of years ago. Saw Dirk Bentley a couple of years ago. Was at John Party earlier this spring. He was here back in May, one of the first concerts back after not having any last year. So yeah, I think we're not in Nashville. We don't have just a ton of stuff. It's neat that we have this amphitheater, and I just like going, like having a good time. It's sort of, in some ways, we get sitters for the children, and just me and Morgan can go out. And in some ways, it's like being back in college, and just.
So I'm more of like a Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson.
Just good. Yeah.
Railroad music kind of guy.
Yeah.
It's like, what was it making you listen to Uncle Lucius the other day, which is like more in that kind of vein. And you're more of the, I like to rap in the middle of my country song.
Oh, you've already said that.
Florida Georgia Line.
Who canceled all their shows the rest of the year and didn't like to see. But yeah, so, yes, I have no problem with Luke Bryan, Florida Georgia Line, Aldine.
Just for clarity, I don't mind rap. I just think the combination of rap and country music is a strange fusion. But I'm glad you like it.
It worked, like I said, it works fine. I like.
Do you have bedazzled jeans? Do you have jeans that have like rhinestones on them and stuff?
These are my jeans that I wear to the office. Sometimes it's light blue Wranglers, sometimes it's dark blue Wranglers. So there's a variety. But
well, look, I'll tell you this. I'm teasing you. I hope that more people can get out soon.
That's true.
I hope that the Delta variant is peaking. We're going to get back to some normal levels. And that we get to a point where people can have normal life again, enjoy a concert, enjoy a meal with friends, get out and sort of experience the world and not be disconnected and isolated.
Even if it's a Luke Bryan concert?
Even if it's a Luke Bryan concert. I'm not saying that's going to be my choice, but I'm glad that you will enjoy it. So,
do you and Ann Harlan want to come? I'm sure
I just need you to stop talking so I can tell the good people that we're done for the week. Folks, thank you for tuning into the Front Porch. We will be back next week. Appreciate you watching and listening.